At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dana Sinopoli, understanding the psychological effects of our immigration policy. Dr. Sinopoli has been in private practice for over 5 years in Philadelphia and works with people who present with a desire to more fully understand themselves, their histories, and their relationships through an in-depth collaborative process. She has taught a graduate course on psychological trauma, presented workshops to law enforcement and attorneys on trauma-informed forensic interviewing, and most recently been interviewed in print and on the air on the psychological effects of the administration's zero tolerance policy. Please welcome Dr. Sinopoli.
It's wonderful to be here today and to see faces I know and faces I will know soon. I want to thank Leader Hugh for entrusting me with the Sunday speech and Betsy Lightborn for reaching out and facilitating this. I also want to mention that my parents drove over 8 hours from Ohio to hear me speak for less than 30 minutes. According to their parental math, this evens out and makes perfect sense.
I hear you very well.
Oh, you can?
Yeah,
Okay. I've not heard that. I usually don't hear that, so I'll speak in. This is a time when community and connection are particularly important, and I am fortified by experiences such as this, where people come together in the service of putting a bit more goodness and justice into the world. Alice Walker, the author, once said, "Activism is the rent I pay for living on this planet." I think she's right. And there is much for us to be active about these days. Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed to the Supreme Court last week in spite of multiple allegations of sexual assault and a volatile and disrespectful temperamental display. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change just released its report of a strong risk of crisis as early as 2040. There have been 288 school shootings since 2009. African Americans are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of white Americans, and we are still debating the right of health care in this country. While much of what I want to speak about today involves the mistreatment of migrant children and families, there is much for us to fight for. This said, I want you all to know that I am going to move from anguish to hopefulness today. So please hang in with me and trust that my intention is not to leave us all in a depleted state of hopelessness and depression, but rather just the opposite. My very wise colleague Jessica Benjamin often reminds me that when reading the news, I must, quote, protect my amygdala, which is the part of the brain that processes emotions. And I want you all to know that I am keeping all of our amygdala in mind today. Speaking of the amygdala, I should say that I am a clinical psychologist in private practice just a few blocks from here. I have been a political activist since undergrad and graduate school, and just as the personal is political, it is probably no surprise that my individual work with patients is also inextricably linked with the greater socio-political context. Whether politics comes up directly or not, I am of the theory that both our internal and interpersonal worlds cannot be considered separately from the zeitgeist. While my clinical work with patients is the central aspect of why I went into the field of psychology, certainly opportunities such as this, when I can bring psychology off the couch, so to speak, allow my professional world to feel more full. This past May, President Trump and Attorney General Jeff Sessions put in place a policy known as zero tolerance. In what seemed like an overnight occurrence, thousands of children were forcibly separated from their parents at our border. Children as young as 4 months old were put in chain-linked fences, which were referred to as dog kennels by guards, with no understanding of what was happening or why, or if they would ever see their parents again. I noticed that everything I was reading and watching about this seemed to focus solely on the policy itself, with such little emphasis on what this experience was actually like through the eyes of these children. And so I wrote a letter that was eventually signed by over 13,000 mental health professionals and over 45 professional mental health organizations and over 8,000 members of the public. President Trump, Attorney General Sessions, Secretary of Homeland Security Kirstjen Nielsen, Speaker Paul Ryan, and the leaders of the House and Senate each got their own copy of the letter and all of the signatures, and I joined the many others who were actively and loudly involved in demanding a recognition that this policy was traumatizing children. Well, it does not take a psychologist to know that children do better in close proximity to their parents. We have known for decades that the separation of children from their parents contributes to significant psychological harm. Anna Freud, Sigmund Freud's daughter, observed children in the Hampstead nurseries in London at the outset of World War II and found that the children who remained with their parents, even while bombs dropped, fared better than the children whose parents left them in nurseries to try and protect them from the bombs. Psychoanalyst Renee Spitz continued this effort to study infant separation, and his 1943 film, Grief, a Peril in Infancy, documented a syndrome called hospitalism, which is marked by impaired physical development, disruption of perceptual motor skills, and language delay. It is now understood that this syndrome was caused by a lack of social contact between the infants and their caregivers, of which so many of the children in these detention centers today are also deprived. We also know that many Holocaust survivors identify the moment of being separated from their parents as the single most terrifying event and the one that haunted them throughout their lives. In the 1950s, John Bowlby and James Robertson studied children in hospitals and found that regardless of how well cared for they are, children, especially young children, suffer when they are not in consistent contact with their mothers. Bowlby and Robertson identified 3 phases that children in separation from attachment figures go through, and we recognize these phases again in the reports and from the clips of the children who were separated at our borders. The first phase occurs immediately and is known as the protest phase. It is marked by the child's obvious distress, which we saw in the images of children crying and yelling inconsolably as they tried to find their parents and bring them back. Children are typically used to their parents coming for them when they scream and cry, and for nonverbal children especially, this is all they have at their disposal to communicate distress. This stressful protest phase activates the sympathetic nervous system, which controls our fight or flight response, which releases a flooding of cortisol to the child's system. This affects a child's heart and sleep and internal regulation. If separation continues for even a few weeks, the child may enter the second stage of despair. We heard reports of children who had been separated at the border described as quiet, withdrawn, not playing or engaging, with little interest in anything. The child in despair relinquishes hope that her mother will return and appears to be settling into the acceptance that this is her new life, one without her parents. The difficult part of this is that these are the well-behaved children in the tents. the ones who were used to demonstrate how well-adjusted the children were. If reunification does occur, it will take longer for these children to get over the experience and to begin to trust that their parents won't be taken away from them again. The world has become a place where security can be destroyed at any moment, and many children feel a sense of anger towards their parents for leaving them. It is probably not hard to imagine how the fear that loved ones can suddenly disappear could impact a child's ability to trust and feel safe in the world, even past childhood. In the last phase of detachment, the child once again shows interest in his surroundings and may even interact with others. Yet if this child is reunited with his parents, he seems hardly to know them or to care, which is why this is the most serious. The child is understood to have psychically killed off his love and need for his mother or father in order to recover. When eventually reunited, these children often appear emotionally distant and changed, and their relationships with others are often marked by distrust and superficiality. This is the most difficult stage to undo, and it can occur just after months of separation. It is also necessary for us to note the compounding trauma experienced by these children and families. Preceding the traumatic separation from their parents, these children experienced or witnessed violence and terror in their country of origin, and then went through the dangerous and terrifying journey itself to the United States. Imagine surviving all of that, with the image of America as a land of safety if you could just make it there, and being met instead with an officer ordering separation. Let me be clear that children are not a one-size-fits-all group, and not all of the children separated from their parents will suffer the most severe effects of this traumatic experience. There are various factors, including age and duration of detainment, and internal resources and interpersonal support, all of which affect resiliency and healing. But certainly, we must not turn our backs on the reality that many children have been traumatized by a policy enacted by the United States, and that this trauma will be transmitted from one generation to the next. The days and weeks following this policy announcement were filled with litigation, strongly led by the ACLU, and by protest and opposition, strongly led by citizens. And President Trump issued an executive order on June 20th, ending child separation. What this executive order cleared the way for, however, was family detainment. We now have over 13,000 migrant children in detention centers, which are euphemistically referred to as family residential centers. There are still hundreds of children who remain separated despite a July 26th court order reunification deadline, and holes in immigration laws are allowing state court judges to grant custody of migrant children to American families without notifying their deported parents. Detaining children and their parents is not an alternative or a correction of the zero tolerance policy. And we must make no mistake that this is a substitution of one traumatizing and terrorizing situation for another. Within these detention centers, children and parents are given badges and numbers. Their lives are dictated by schedules enforced by guards they do not know. While there is variability from child to child, we know that it is destabilizing for a child to see a parent in a consistent state of fear, hopelessness, or helplessness. And children may then feel responsible for their parents' well-being in a role reversal that can have long-lasting effects. We know that in optimal environments, parents determine when it is time to sleep, eat, and wake up, and that healthy attachment is marked by family play and physical contact, both of which allow a child to feel safe and attended to. In these detention centers, there is little family autonomy or opportunity to play, and it is the guards, untrained in child care or family development, who are in charge of children and parents' schedules. There are also reports of children being disciplined for climbing into their mother's beds for comfort. Some of the children in these detention centers have become violent towards themselves and others. There are reports of children not eating, of not sleeping, of not playing, of having suicidal thoughts, of exhibiting symptoms of anxiety and depression and acute and post-traumatic stress. There are also reports of physical and sexual abuse and the denial of medical treatment when timely care is critical. These children will be more likely to suffer from substance abuse, future trauma, heart disease, and poor overall health, difficulty in relationships, attention problems, and are likely to live a life of looking over their shoulder in fear and avoiding social programs that could ease their suffering. And just a few weeks ago, we learned that children are being rounded up in the middle of the night and moved by bus to tent cities in Texas with no recognition of the psychological and physiological effects this has on them. We know that traumatic memories are stored or encoded differently from non-traumatic memories. When the mind is overloaded, as is the case during a traumatic experience, it will actually protect itself by only focusing on enough to survive. Oftentimes, the emotional parts of the brain shut down, and the emotional experience of the traumatic event is split off from consciousness. This is why details of traumatic experiences often show up in confusing and bewildering ways, what have come to be known as symptoms, including flashbacks, nightmares, panic, disordered eating, anxiety and depression, inattention, and emotional dysregulation. The prolonged separation and detention of infants and young children is understood to be an adverse childhood experience, which increases these children's proclivities towards becoming involved with substances, criminal activity and impulsivity, dropping out of school, and since those most vulnerable to trauma are those who have been traumatized, these children are at increased risk for future traumatization. We also know that the impacts of these traumatic experiences will be felt for at least 3 generations, as trauma does not stop with the generation directly affected by it. We read the news so quickly, and sometimes in almost a daydream-like state. When we do this, we are protecting our amygdala so as not to overwhelm our own system. Perhaps you even noticed yourself doing this or wanting to do this while I've been talking. Which brings me to the part of today where anguish can transform into hope and activism through a process in trauma literature known as witnessing. In the book, The Power of Witnessing, Reflections, Reverberations, and Traces of the Holocaust, Nancy Goodman writes that witnessing makes one, quote, more human and more desirous of recognizing hatred and naming it as such. It is okay, she goes on, to have nightmares to be more human. It is important to know the unbearable. When we imagine what it feels like to be separated from a child or from our parents as children, when we try and understand how a human being could look at another human being and see not a person but an alien and then treat them as such, we are engaging in the process of witnessing. And it is this experience of witnessing the unbearable that connects human beings to one another and that compels us to act. We are in the midst of a political time that is marked by those in power determined to tell us what is real and what is not. That we are not to trust what we see with our eyes, what we hear with our ears, what we know in our minds, and what we feel in our hearts. We are in the midst of a political time that is marked by those in power determined to tell us who matters and who does not, and who has a right to be recognized as a human being. We are in the midst of a political time that is marked by those in power determined to make it acceptable to hate and to discount and to mock. And we are in the midst of a political time that overwhelms us daily with statements and actions of inhumanity and cruelty. Let us also remember, though, that we are in the midst of a political time that is marked by an uprising of resistance and activism and a commitment by so many of us to trust our eyes and our ears and our minds and our hearts. We are in the midst of a political time that is marked by a long overdue recognition that we have not valued all lives equally, and that our African American community continues to pay the price of slavery and injustice. We are in the midst of a political time that is marked by a societal reckoning of violence and harassment against women, and an outpouring of support for Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, Ms. Deborah Ramirez, and Ms. Julie Sletnick, and we are for once listening to women. We are in the midst of a political time where high schoolers are marching out and taking gun control into their own hands, and I know many of us are waiting for them to turn 18. And we are in the midst of a political time when our airports were filled with Americans protesting the travel ban, and the presence of immediate protest in response to the zero tolerance policy was unlike anything we had seen before. Hope lies in remembering that even in the darkest of these political times, we are also in the midst of a movement that is marked by a refusal to allow hatred to go unnoticed and a refusal by so many of us to be silent. So, my friends, where do we go from here? What do we do with the outrage and the heartache we feel? What do we do when we think about the 13,000 children who remain detained like criminals for a crime they never commit? What do we do when we think about the internal anguish a mother must feel when she has to choose between holding her terrified child and risking refugee status? What do we do when we imagine a father having no control over the whereabouts or treatment of his family? What do? We witness, and we act from that position of witness. And we demand that our politicians witness, and we vote out those who do not. And some nights we lose sleep. Sometimes it's because of anguish, and other times it's because we are too busy not allowing the anguish to stop us. And we take what a friend of mine calls vacations from anger when we need them. And then we get back involved, and we stay compassionately angry, and we have difficult conversations, and we speak loudly when it is called for, and we take care of ourselves and one another. Witnessing and action, after all, are hard work. You will notice that the witnessing I am describing is not one of silent bystander or blind eye. The witnessing I am talking about, and that I believe we are enacting right now in this moment, is the active process of profound connection with that which is unbearable. And it is from this place of deep recognition that true socio-political change comes. I have on my bookshelf, in my grandfather's handwriting, a note card I found in his study. I think of him often these days, and I have asked my grandmother, his love of 61 years and one of the loudest feminist voices I know, what he would have to say about the world as we know it if he were still here. We both agree his response would encourage action and opposition, as well as his hopeful reminder whenever things felt dire, this too shall pass. My grandfather was taken as a prisoner of war in the Battle of the Bulge. He allowed me the great honor of witnessing his memories by returning an empty journal I gave him when I was 9, filled with the stories of his life. He spent his years teaching history and supporting various human rights efforts. Certainly my first understanding of why labor unions are necessary occurred sitting next to him when I could barely spell the word union. The note on my bookshelf in my grandfather's handwriting says this: "In a place where no one acts as a human being, strive to be a human being." I can think of no message more necessary than this right now. While we must know the unbearable and recognize the human capacity for hatred and cruelty, striving to be a human being is also what allows us to profoundly connect with one another. For many of us, standing with those who are silenced is the rent we will pay each and every time we are asked, even when the cost is high. Thank you.